slides up.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Right, whenever you're ready.
We're ready to go.
Right.
Rose. There you go.
Right, okay. Oh, is it me? That's right. For anybody listening in, there I am, Queen of IT. Hello, everybody. I'm Rose Clesham, and I'm the Director of Academic Standards and Measurement at Pearson, and I work in Pearson Tests of English at the moment, but I've spent my career really either teaching or developing tests or evaluating tests. So I'm delighted to run this session today and talk to you about AI, which is the area that I work in now, and how really it's not something that's going to happen sometime in the future in terms of educational assessments. It's actually happening now. So I'll show you a few slides, and then I understand that you're going to have some discussional points during the session afterwards. Okay. So thanks, Mira. Okay, so I'm going to run through a few slides. It'll be about half an hour. We should just give you a bit of a background in terms of how we make use of AI in educational assessment. So, as students of assessment, then these are the first principles. These are the key questions that we have to ask ourselves, really. It's about first of all really making sure that we're clear about the purposes of assessment. You know, what's it for, and whichever type of assessment you then are trying to plan or you're trying to operate, is it fit for purpose, and then really does it achieve its purpose? And really, obviously, the reason why we carry out educational assessments in the first place are either sort of for formative purposes, for summative purposes, but also for evaluation purposes, where we actually hold particular institutions accountable for the way that for the ways that they use data. A key factor in this is to go back to the notion of alignment, and these are the four types of curriculum. Intended curriculum is sort of what specifications intend a program of study to deliver. The enacted curriculum is actually what actually happens in the classroom. Is that enacted? Is the intended curriculum actually enacted by teachers and students? The assessed curriculum is then what do we assess people on? And then a learned curriculum is, well, what do you end up with? What are the learning outcomes? And in theory, those four alignments of curriculum should all be exactly the same. But actually, quite often, in particular, the intended curriculum and the assessed curriculum are not the same. So we have an issue of curriculum, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then the second thing to say clearly is that, you know, within assessment, for assessment test development agencies or governmental agencies, the two things that they're trying to do all the time is to try and make the test as valid as possible. In other words, to make it as fit for purpose as possible, but also to make it as reliable as possible. There's no point in pretending that you're creating a great assessment if the data doesn't support differentiation, and if people aren't sort of showing that they are showing proficiency or that they're better or worse at certain things. So those two things are key attributes, and even though it's obvious, sometimes there are real conflicts between those two. But go back to the idea of the curriculum. One of the problems with assessments, either national assessments or international assessments, is that quite often the intended curriculum and the assessed curriculum are not the same. And in particular, what happens is that we come to a sort of lowest common denominator, where assessments that consist of things that you can easily measure, and not always things that you should assess. So in particular, if you think about English language, quite often speaking skills are actually taken out of assessment specifications because they're hard to do. That takes out a quarter of the construct of language proficiency. If you think about sciences, over the last sort of 5 years, 10 years, there's been a decrease in the amount of practical skills that are being assessed because they're quite difficult to assess reliably, and so they've been taken out. Geography fieldwork skills have now been taken out of many sort of large-scale, high-stakes exams. What that's done is it's sort of narrowed the curriculum in terms of only assessing what we can assess particularly in a paper-based assessment world. So to go back to the reliability and validity, is the more prescient question. You know, does that assessment measure what it should be, what it's intended to measure? Do the results confirm and give a good picture of what students can understand and what they sort of can do within an agreed construct? Can we trust the outcomes? And most important question really is, what do the stakeholders think? And the stakeholders are often the accepting institutions with their schools or universities, but even teachers and the students themselves have to have trust in the assessment. And the reliability is a subset of validity, because validity can't happen unless the actual results themselves can be trusted to be reliable. Some of them are calibrated by sort of classical versions of reliability. Some of them are now using psychometric measures, which is the one that I'm going to talk about today. And obviously then, how reliable is the marking? So all these things are crucial subsets of assessment validity. In this country, people have been talking about e-assessment for over 10 years. So Ken Boston, who was the chief executive of QCA, a governmental regulator, said over 10 years ago, you know, I expect all on-screen assessments and new qualifications to be around by 2009. And obviously, you know, not only can we use it for summative assessment purposes, but, you know, the drive towards personalised learning, assessment on demand, rapid feedback, all those things made e-assessment a very attractive option. But of course, it didn't happen. It hasn't happened large scale, because in some ways, the logistics of e-assessment have always been problematic. And so what's actually happening now, I believe, is that the emergence of AI will actually overtake the emergence of e-assessment as we thought of it 10 years ago. So people talk about AI, and it's a fairly generic term, and people within education circles sort of take it back to perhaps 1997, where Garry Kasparov was beaten by Big Blue. It was a programmable computer that was calculating a next move after every move that he did. It actually goes way back from then, but it's a good starting point to actually keep in mind in terms of the late 90s, in terms of when AI became a tangible thing that were entered into people's consciousness. And we all know that these companies use AI and the algorithms of AI in the way that they operate. We're all familiar with that. But it's also used in education. So not talked about a great deal in education. And I think one of the issues that that education has often had is that it lagged behind technological breakthroughs. Whereas I think if we do it right, we can use the power of AI as it's developing right now for for student recruitment, for teaching and learning, for student support, and actually for formative and summative assessment. And the area that I'm going to talk to you about is an area that actually started using AI 10 years ago and transformed the notion of sort of large-scale, high-stakes assessment from the diagram you can see at the top there, where you have this scenario, the familiar scenario that everybody's got to be in the same room at the same time on the same date in this extremely high-stressed situation, to the picture at the bottom, which is how that type of testing situation is now seen using AI, where people book a test and they want to do it today or they want to do it tomorrow, and they book in and they go into a testing centre and they can talk and they can hear, you know, sort of language, and they can react in a sort of a more authentic way at a time that suits them. So the example I'm going to give you is this English language test, but there are many other assessments that are in the throes of being developed now in terms of making use of AI. So in this particular language test that I'm going to talk about, it is computer based. It is all automatically scored. The really important is that it assesses all 4 communication skills. So it isn't a selective construct. It is the whole construct. And some of those items assess single skills, and some of those items have skills put together to make them more authentic. So you'd have to maybe listen to something and then write something down, and both of those skills can be assessed. The authenticity and construct representation are the 2 major key variables, I think, in terms of how we can improve our assessment practices. And so, you know, yes, you know, the automated scoring in terms of listening and reading are all familiar, you know, sort of multiple choice and multiple option sort of item types that many of you have probably seen and used over the years. These are all familiar territory in terms of automatically scored items. But the 2 major areas where we're actually using AI are in the 2 areas where it gives it real authenticity, and actually they're the areas that for human marking are the most problematic, and they are the assessment of speaking and the assessment of writing, where every single response will be different, and that is very challenging. But it also, I think, makes the point about why AI is so crucial to the expansion of the use of technology for assessments. So in this type of item, they look at an image, they're allowed 25 seconds to have a look at the image, and then they have to speak for 40 seconds and describe what they see, and their voice is picked up and then sent for assessment. Okay, and the writing, again, a writing prompt. They're given a prompt. They're given 20 minutes where they can plan and write and rewrite, do whatever they want, write their responses down, and then again that is sent off to be assessed. So within those 2 skills, within writing and within speaking, they're not an absolute definitive list, but they are the skill areas that are generally used in AI to assess writing and to assess speaking. So that in writing, depending on the assessment, they may, for example, particularly be interested in the style and obviously the technical structure and the mechanics of and grammar of a response. So you can choose which traits you would want to assess. And the same with speaking, that again, you might think that pronunciation and accuracy and fluency are the most important traits. So you select the traits that you want that assessment to measure. But the point being that you can assess a number of traits all at the same time, which in human assessment is really difficult to do, certainly reliably. How are they done? I'm going to give you a very short version of this. Basically, every single item that we put into this test is trialed by thousands of people. We have an acoustic model of the English language, which forms the basis then of understanding what people have said. We get human markers to transcribe for each item about 1,000 of the responses and mark them. And so then the transcription and the scoring are then inputted into our machine learned engines. And so it has a base then to actually to have had a pretty good representation of the ways and the accents and the styles that people could have answered that item. And we would hope then that item has been trained for. At that point, we lock it down, and then we enter a validation phase where we take another, let's say, 500 to 1,000 items of that item. We also then get them to be marked by expert humans, ratings, and then we see what the correlation is between the human ratings and the machine scores. If there's a difference, then the humans win and that item doesn't go any further. So what we're looking for is extremely high correlation between the expert human ratings for items and the machine scores. When you have a face-to-face interview, it sounds like the best option, really. But I mean, from my point of view, the least problematic area is the logistical issue, which is actually, it's just quite difficult to get maybe 2 raters in at the same time and to arrange the time and space. Those are problems. But there's more than that to it, really. One of the, and it's been well documented, one of the issues with having face-to-face interviews to assess speaking is that you never really get exactly the same experience from one assessment to another. Sometimes people feel sorry for the person that's sitting in front of them, and they'll give them a slight leading sort of question, or they might be harsh. It's really difficult to actually get a complete even assessment on a sort of a person-to-person basis. Whereas with a machine learning, everybody, wherever you are, you get exactly the same experience. And the example of this assessment is just to say, you know, that obviously you can, this particular assessment uses these 4 traits for speaking, and one of the important features is that you don't just have one type of item type, you have a mixture of item types, some of which are very short, some of which are much longer, and therefore it mixes and matches a situation up. I don't know whether this will work. No, I did have an audio here to give you an example of what the speech actually looks like. But this is the speech pattern from a proficient speaker. This is the sort of data that sits in within the engine, and you can see the scores that it obtained for that response, and also you can see from the pattern of the response what it looked like. And for somebody who's less proficient, this was, again, they had to repeat the same phrase, but their pronunciation wasn't quite as good. They stuttered a bit, and so their fluency wasn't good, and they actually made one actual word error. So the machine is able to pick up quite fine nuances. And we get loads of information. So we obviously get the waveform, we can see the spectrum. Because we have an acoustic model, everything they say is converted into textual language, so we can actually check that actually what they have actually said. In terms of writing, we use a system called latent semantic analysis, which again 10 years ago was quite a thing, really. These days it's used actually a fair amount for assessment purposes. Latent semantic analysis, what it does is it absorbs loads of text and then begins to develop an understanding of the meaning of the text. So it's less bothered about the surface level features of written responses, and it's more concerned with whether the responses themselves make sense when you actually read it. And therefore you can imagine that you could get completely different responses on a topic, but they would actually potentially be scored exactly the same way because they essentially said the same thing. Okay, so again we use the same sort of system. We train the engines first, which have been expert marked. We then lock it down and validate it with another set of data and check to see whether the machine scores have extremely high correlations with the human scores. The correlations of these sort of writing and speaking are in the 9.9s. They are really, really high. If you run reliability studies of marking essays or speaking assessments, you would be very hard pressed to get reliability figures that high. That's one of the problems with writing and speaking in terms of their reliability levels. looks weird, this, but basically, if you can imagine the latent semantic analysis is almost like a 3D diagram. What that engine is doing is it's looking at a response in loads of different sort of dimensions and putting a new response somewhere in that space. So it works on a completely sort of different paradigm to how human marking, how we would normally envisage it. So you could, again, like I said before, you can choose what sort of things you might be interested in, depending maybe on whether it's a formative assessment, whether it's a summative assessment. You can look at sort of any level of detail you want. But what's important is that it also knows when it doesn't know. Okay, it doesn't use surface level features, so it doesn't give scores on the basis of the number of words that people used, or using, you know, when we're trying to use impressive language in assessments, when we see like thus or therefore or thereby, takes those out, and it actually looks at the meaning of what you've said. But if there's something in that response that it doesn't quite understand what's going on, then that response is then sent to a human rater. Sometimes it's because they actually have written in a different language, and sometimes it's because they have not answered the question, that they've decided that they can't answer the question they've been asked, and they just write on something completely different. If it doesn't know what's happening, it's always verified by humans. And we have reliability studies in the first place, so we get human raters to mark the traits and then compare them against the IEA is the machine scored. If they're not right, if there's any severe difference between those two, we would assume that the human raters are right, and we would not use that within the engine. One of the key features, like I said, in terms of validity and reliability, validity is key, and in my view, is the most important aspects that we're assessing what we want to assess, and that we've got construct representation. But there's no question that reliability is important here. And the thing about these sort of tests, these both computer-based tests, and also these AI-delivered tests, they are incredibly high, have high levels of reliability, which means basically you're just going to get less error. So if whatever score you get, there is a pretty low possibility that you would get maybe 2 or 3 marks difference. If you did that test a number of times. Those are key measures in terms of the quality of tests. And so, you know, to finish really, AI can be used in these are the sort of things that I think has a lot to promote it. We can think about a complete construct instead of just choosing parts of a subject matter that we want to assess easily. All those items have been pre-tested and psychometrically scored, so we know A, that they're going to work, and also how difficult and demanding they are. We obviously use item banks, so it's very, very unlikely that you're ever going to see the same question twice, and if you're in a testing environment, everybody on their separate workstations is going to get a different version of the test. We know the test reliability is going to be high. We're able to, because it's all sort of data led, we can check to see whether there are any diff issues, whether there is any sort of differential item functioning on any level we want, whether it's to do with gender, whether it's to do with locality, whether it's to do with age, just to double check that the standard and quality of the items on the tests are right. We absolutely use human judgment here in terms of setting the systems up in the first place. This is not a sort of a remote activity that a machine is doing, and therefore, you know, by using sort of a representative sample of human writing and human speaking, we can take out the bias, so that everybody taking that test, wherever they take it, will get the same result. This is a great quote from Fei-Fei Li, who's the chief scientist at Google, and she's a professor at Stanford. She's a great person to follow on Twitter, actually. She says some really, really interesting things. You know, I often tell my students not to be misled by the name artificial intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it. AI is made by humans and intended to behave by humans, and ultimately to impact human lives and human society. And another quote that's you know, very helpful really in making sure that we don't fall into dichotomous arguments, sort of saying, oh well, it should all be human marked or it should all be machine marked. What we're trying to do, I think, in this space is try to do the things that are better done by humans and by machines. Okay, this sort of virtuous relationship really between you know, allowing teachers some time off in some respects, even in formative ways of actually having to mark sort of, you know, 50 essays a night. Students can write essays in these formative programs as much as they want, and they'll get informed feedback. But actually, if you want to enact feedback, then that's obviously the place and the power of teachers. Just quick survey that was done a couple of years ago in to ask people why do you think why do you choose to use computer-based testing or AI-based testing? People are increasingly voting with their feet. There was a time, let's say, where people were far more nervous about using computers in assessment and feeling that somehow it was a bit of a novelty, really. Actually, I mean, for example, in this English test that I'm talking about, the average age of people taking this test is in their sort of late 20s. There's no question that people are voting with their feet. They like the computer-based test. They do think that it gives them more unbiased results. And of course, they get turnaround, they get feedback way quicker. On average, these tests, if you take a test, let's say today, you'll get your scores back probably maybe tomorrow or the latest the day after. They're incredibly quick turnarounds. And so, you know, in general then, not just to do with the test I've been talking about, but in general, you know, we need to think about how testing and how assessment works, not just in one place. These, you know, you're familiar with you have to have your right plug depending on where you are in the world. But if you have one of these, you can travel well. And I think what we need to increasingly make sure is that if we are moving towards sort of notions of global proficiencies and global assessments, we have to make sure that they are fair to everybody. You can do, you know, I've been involved in doing sort of work like this over the years, really, where you get paper-based tests and you get computer-based tests, and you work out in some ways quantitatively and in some ways qualitatively what is the difference between the reliability and validity of certain item types. And in general, if they're done well, computer-based testing comes out favourably. And so I'll finish on this slide. This is a very famous painting that's found in the National Gallery in London. It's called an experiment on a bird in an air pump, and it was a sort of at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, where people were being shown the power of science and the power of things that you couldn't necessarily see and understand easily. And this painting is a marvellous painting to show different perspectives of the players, in terms of some people being really keen to engage with new ideas, and some people being more reluctant and being more hesitant, you know, and maybe hark after a golden age, which we know probably never was. And so I ask anybody that is in this module to think about, well, where do you lie? Where would you lie in this painting? Would you be somebody who was being very sort of understandably sort of cautious about where we go in terms of computer-based testing and AI, or do you think that this is really something that we should make sure that we, as educational assessment people, that we make sure that those things are used to the best effect, both formatively and summatively? So I hope that's been of interest to you. Contact me if you have any questions, and I know that Mary's going to lead you through some activities to explore some of the principles that I've talked about. And so thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your session.